An alpha king once married an obese omega as a bet, and in doing so, sealed the fate of his entire kingdom. The wager was simple. Choose a bride the court would reject. Prove that power alone could create a queen and claim victory over a friend who dared to question his control. He pointed to a woman scrubbing stairs in the corner of his banquet hall. A nobody, a servant, a body the nobles had trained themselves not to see. He expected her to be grateful, compliant, temporary. He did not expect her to be the most dangerous woman in his court. For 7 years, she had moved through that palace like a shadow, gathering secrets while they laughed at her expense. She knew which advisors were stealing, which nobles were scheming, which alliances would crumble under pressure. She had built her freedom in silence, one documented lie at a time, waiting for the perfect moment to disappear into a life where no one could ever use her again. And then the king made her his queen. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the mate bond he felt the instant their hands touched was not a gift. It was a complication, a trap, a vulnerability neither of them could afford, and somewhere in the shadows, a duke who had orchestrated their union smiled, certain that his plan to destroy the king had just begun. But to understand how a wager became a reckoning, we need to return to the beginning, to the night everything changed. The banquet hall of Thornwood Palace gleamed like something out of a dream, if dreams could smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Mira kept her head down as she scrubbed the marble steps just outside the grand archway, her brush moving in steady, practiced circles. The noise from inside was deafening. Laughter. Music. The crash of goblets meeting in drunken toasts. She had learned long ago not to look up. 7 years she'd been here. 7 years of making herself small, invisible, unremarkable. It was a skill she'd honed to perfection, the art of being furniture. The nobles didn't see her when they passed. The servants barely remembered her name. And that was exactly how she needed it. Her fingers tightened on the brush handle as a fresh wave of laughter rolled out from the hall. They were celebrating something tonight. Some victory, some alliance. It didn't matter. The court was always celebrating something, always finding reasons to drink themselves into oblivion, while people like her scrubbed their messes away. "To the king!" someone roared from inside, and the hall erupted in cheers. Mira's wolf stirred faintly beneath her ribs, restless, curious. She ignored it. Her wolf had opinions she couldn't afford to entertain. The voices inside grew louder, sharper. Not celebration anymore. Something else. She paused, brush hovering over wet stone, and tilted her head just slightly. Years of eavesdropping had taught her to parse the tones of court drama, the difference between banter and blood sport. This was blood sport. "You're too controlled, cousin." The voice was smooth, amused, carrying easily through the archway. Duke Garrett, she recognized his drawl anywhere. "Too obsessed with what they think. When was the last time you did something truly audacious?" A pause. Then another voice, lower, colder, edged with irritation. "I don't have the luxury of audacity, Garrett. I have a kingdom to run." King Theron. Mira's hands stilled completely. She shouldn't be listening to this. She should move away, find another set of stairs, disappear before someone noticed her. But something in Garrett's tone made her wolf press closer to the surface, listening. "That's precisely my point." Garrett sounded delighted now. "Dangerous. You're so careful, so measured. I wonder if you even remember what it feels like to defy expectations. What are you suggesting? A wager?" The hall went quieter. Not silent. The music still played, the fire still crackled, but the quality of the noise changed. People were listening now. Mira bent lower over her bucket. Every muscle in her body coiled tight. "If you're so powerful," Garrett continued, "prove it. Choose a bride the court would reject. Make her a queen they have to respect. If you succeed within a year, I'll cede my ducal seat. If you fail," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "you admit publicly that your power is nothing but performance." The bucket handle bit into Mira's palm. She should leave, she should. "You're drunk," Theron said flatly. "I'm serious." Garrett's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the hall. Unless you're afraid. A mistake. Mira knew it instantly, the way she knew when a storm was coming. You didn't challenge an alpha king in front of his entire court. You didn't question his strength, his nerve, his "I accept." The words fell like stones into water. Mira's heart kicked once, hard. Excellent. Garrett sounded triumphant, too triumphant. Then let me save you the trouble of choosing. I'll pick for you. A pause. Footsteps. How about her? The world tilted. Mira looked up. Garrett stood in the archway, golden-haired and grinning like a wolf with a rabbit in its teeth. His finger pointed directly at her. At Mira. At the girl with the scrub brush and the stained apron and the body that had never, not once in 7 years, drawn anything but pity or mockery. Every eye in the hall turned toward her. She couldn't breathe. The king appeared behind Garrett, moving into the archway with the kind of grace that made the air feel heavier. Slate-gray eyes. Sharp jaw. A face carved from stone and exhaustion. He looked at her. Truly looked, and something flickered across his expression. Surprise. Confusion. His wolf must have felt it too, because his pupils dilated for just a heartbeat. Then his face went carefully blank. Done, Theron said. The word cracked through the hall like a whip. Mira's knees threatened to buckle. This wasn't real. This couldn't be Rise. The king commanded, his voice carrying the weight of an alpha's authority. Her body obeyed before her mind could catch up. She stood, scrub brush still clutched in one shaking hand, bucket sloshing at her feet. The court stared. Some were laughing. Others looked scandalized. Lady Corrine whispered something behind her fan that made the women around her snicker. Theron descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate. He stopped 3 feet away from her. Close enough that she could smell him pine and smoke and something wilder underneath. Close enough that her wolf whined and pressed forward, confused and yearning. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Her mouth was dry as ash. Mira. Mira. He said it like he was testing the shape of it, then, louder, to the hall. "Mira will be my queen." The laughter exploded, delighted. Cruel. The kind of laughter that shredded dignity and left nothing but humiliation in its wake. Mira stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed invisibility burn to ash around her. And somewhere deep in the palace shadows, Duke Garrett smiled. Within the hour, 2 guards escorted her to the Queen's chambers rooms. She'd cleaned 100 times but never imagined entering as anything but a servant. They left her there without a word, closing the heavy doors behind them with a finality that made her stomach turn. The whispers started before she'd even crossed the threshold. "A month," one of them muttered. "She'll be gone in a month." Mira didn't sleep. She sat in a velvet chair by the window, watching dawn creep across the palace gardens, and tried to calculate her next move. The Queen's chambers were absurdly beautiful silk curtains, carved furniture, a bed large enough to drown in. Everything she'd cleaned 100 times. Everything that had never been meant for her. Her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, confused and agitated. It didn't understand what had happened. It only knew the world had shifted, tilted on some invisible axis, and nothing felt stable anymore. Mira understood perfectly. She'd been turned into a spectacle, a joke. And somewhere in this palace, Duke Garrett was probably laughing about it. The door opened without warning. She didn't turn, didn't stand, just kept her gaze on the gardens and waited. "I assume you understand the situation," the king said. His voice was different from last night, colder, more controlled. The voice of a man who'd sobered up and remembered he was supposed to be in command. "I understand I'm a pawn in someone else's game," Mira said flatly. Silence. Then footsteps crossing the room. She could smell him now, pine and smoke and something sharper underneath. Her wolf lifted its head, interested. She told it to be quiet. "This arrangement doesn't have to be unpleasant," Theron continued. He sounded like he was reading from a script. "You'll be provided for, treated with the respect due to your position. All I ask is that you play the part convincingly for the duration of..." I didn't ask for this. The words came out harder than she'd intended, sharp enough to cut. Theron stopped walking. She could feel his gaze on her back, could sense the shift in his posture, surprise maybe, or irritation. You were given an extraordinary opportunity, he said carefully. Most women would be grateful. Mira turned to face him for the first time. Is that what you expect? Gratitude for being dragged into your humiliation? He stood 3 feet from her chair, dressed in formal council robes that made him look even more untouchable than he had last night. But up close, in morning light, she could see the shadows under his eyes, the tight line of his jaw, the exhaustion he wore like armor. I didn't choose this either, he said quietly. You accepted the bet. He stopped, drew a breath. Yes, I did. At least he didn't lie. Mira studied him, cataloging details the way she always did. The way his hands stayed carefully at his sides, as if he didn't know what to do with them, the faint tension around his mouth. The fact that he was looking at her, actually looking instead of through her the way most nobles did. What do you want from me? She asked. A year, Theron said. 1 year of appearing as my queen in public, attending necessary functions, presenting a united front to the court. At the end of that time, I'll grant you an estate in the countryside, a title that will protect you, and enough money to live independently for the rest of your life. It was a good offer. Better than good. It was freedom. The exact thing she'd been working toward for 7 years. So why did it feel like a trap? And if I refuse, you can't. His voice was gentle, but absolute. The announcement has been made. To retract it now would be seen as weakness. The court would tear us both apart. Us. As if they were a unit. As if she had any say in this. Mira's wolf growled low in her chest, frustrated. She pushed the sensation down, locked it away with all the other things she couldn't afford to feel. 1 year, she repeated. 1 year. She should take it. She should smile and nod and play the role he needed her to play. She should be smart about this. But something in her, some stubborn, reckless part that had survived 7 years of invisibility, refused to make it easy for him. I want the estate in writing, she said. The title legally secured, and I want to guarantee that at the end of this year, no one will ever have the power to force me into marriage again. Theron's eyebrows rose slightly. You don't trust me. I don't trust anyone. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Something else. Something that looked almost like respect. Fair enough, he said. He crossed to a small writing desk, pulled out parchment and ink, and began drafting the agreement. His handwriting was surprisingly precise, each word carefully chosen. Mira watched him work, trying to ignore the way her wolf pressed closer to the surface, trying to catch his scent. When he finished, he brought the document to her. She read it twice. Every clause. Every condition. It was exactly what she'd asked for. Legal. Binding. Escape. Sign it, she said. He did. Then he held out the quill to her. Mira stood. The movement brought her closer to him than she'd intended. Close enough to see the exact shade of gray in his eyes. Close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin. Close enough that when their hands touched as she took the quill, the world tilted. The bond snapped into place like a chain pulled taut. Mate. Her wolf howled the words so loudly, it felt like her entire body was vibrating. The scent of him flooded her senses, pine and smoke, and something wild that made her teeth ache. She could hear his heartbeat, rapid and unsteady, could feel the pull in her chest, a hook lodged somewhere behind her ribs, dragging her toward him. Theron went perfectly still. His pupils dilated, his breathing hitched. He felt it too. For 3 endless seconds they stood frozen, hands still touching, the parchment trembling between them. The bond thrummed in the space between their bodies, alive and demanding and utterly impossible to ignore. Then Theron pulled back. Fast. Like she'd burned him. Mira forced herself to breathe, to think, to shove the bond down into the same locked box where she kept every other inconvenient truth. Sign it, Theron said. His voice was rougher now, unsteady. She signed. Their eyes met over the document. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something raw in his expression, something that matched the ache in her own chest. Then his face went blank. Carefully, deliberately blank. "We have an agreement," he said. "We have an agreement," she echoed. He turned and walked toward the door, putting distance between them with every step. When he reached the threshold, he paused without looking back. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." Then he was gone. Mira stood alone in the Queen's chambers, the signed agreement clutched in her shaking hands, and tried to convince herself that the mate bond didn't matter, that it was just biology, just instinct, just another obstacle to navigate. 1 year. That was all. 1 year, and she'd be free. She turned back to the window, trying to steady her breathing, and froze. On the small table by her bed sat a stack of books. Etiquette manuals. Guides to courtly behavior. Instructions on how a proper queen should walk, talk, dress, and behave. Someone had left them while she slept. A gift. A warning. A reminder that she would never be enough. Mira picked up the top book and opened it to the first page. Then she smiled. They had no idea what she was capable of. The first week as queen was designed to break her. Mira understood that within hours. Every smile was practiced cruelty. Every gesture of politeness came wrapped in thorns. The noble ladies excluded her from their morning gatherings with regretful whispers that carried just far enough for her to hear. The servants who had once worked beside her now looked through her as if she'd become a ghost. And the court. The glittering, vicious court made sport of her presence at every opportunity. She attended a formal luncheon on the 3rd day. The dining hall gleamed with silver and crystal, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Mira wore a gown the palace seamstress had provided, pale blue silk that fit well enough but felt like costume armor. She took her assigned seat near the middle of the table, far from where Saren sat at the head. Distance. Always distance. Lady Corrine, who presided over the noble ladies' circle with the authority of a general, smiled sweetly from across the table. "How wonderful that you're joining us, Your Majesty," she said. The title sounded like an insult in her mouth. "We were just discussing the upcoming trade delegation. Such complex matters. I do hope you're finding the court protocols manageable." Translation: "You don't belong here, and we all know it." Mira returned the smile with one just as empty. "I'm learning." "Of course you are." Corine's gaze swept over her, lingering just long enough to make the judgment clear. "It must be quite overwhelming." The other ladies tittered into their wine glasses. Mira picked up her fork and focused on her plate. Let them laugh. Let them assume she was too stupid or too cowed to understand what they were really saying. Every assumption they made was a gift. Every moment they dismissed her, they revealed themselves. She listened to their conversation with half her attention while cataloging details with the other half. Lady Corrine was having an affair with Lord Finch. The Duchess of Westmarch was embezzling from her husband's estate. The trade delegation they were discussing had already been compromised by bribes from a rival kingdom. Information was currency, and Mira had been collecting it for 7 years. The banquet that night was worse. Torchlight and music filled the great hall. Nobles clustered in groups, their laughter sharp-edged and performative. Mira stood near a column, watching, waiting for the moment she could slip away unnoticed. Her gown tonight was deep green, another gift from the palace wardrobes that fit her body but not the court's aesthetic. She could feel eyes on her, assessing, judging, finding her lacking. Theron sat on the dais with his advisors, looking every inch the king. He hadn't spoken to her since the morning they'd made their deal, hadn't looked at her directly. The mate bond hummed faintly in her chest, a constant ache she was learning to ignore. Professional distance, she reminded herself. That was the agreement. Lady Corrine approached with a glass of wine in each hand, her smile bright and brittle. "Your Majesty, you look positively radiant tonight." The lie was so transparent it would have been funny if it hadn't been so deliberate. "Thank you," Mira said. Corrine stepped closer, as if to offer her one of the glasses. Then she stumbled a perfectly executed accident and red wine splashed across Mira's gown in a dark, spreading stain. The hall went quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that everyone nearby turned to look. "Oh, how clumsy of me." Corinne pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with false horror. "I'm so terribly sorry, Your Majesty. These floors can be so slippery." Mira stood very still. The wine soaked through silk to her skin, cold and sticky. Her wolf bristled, wanting to snarl, but she locked it down. This was a test, a performance, and she knew exactly what the court expected her to do: cry, flee, prove that she was too weak for this world. She would not give them the satisfaction. "It's fine," Mira said evenly. "Accidents happen." Corinne's smile sharpened. "Perhaps you should retire for the evening. I'm sure no one would blame you for enough." The word cut through the hall like a blade. Theron rose from his seat on the dais, his expression carved from ice. He descended the steps with measured, dangerous grace, and the crowd parted for him instinctively, his gaze locked on Corinne. And even from 5 feet away, Mira could feel the weight of his displeasure. "Lady Corinne," he said quietly. Too quietly. "How unfortunate that you've ruined the Queen's gown." Corinne's smile faltered. "It was an accident, Your Majesty. I merely—" "Leave." The command carried the full force of an alpha's voice. Corinne went pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, then curtsied shakily and fled. The hall remained silent. Theron turned to Mira, his eyes unreadable. Then he held out his hand. "Come." She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain the distance they'd agreed upon. But the entire court was watching, and she understood what he was doing, what he was offering: protection, or the appearance of it. Mira placed her hand in his. The bond flared instantly, heat and recognition, and a pulse so strong it made her breath catch. Theron's fingers tightened briefly, as if he felt it too. Then he led her to the dais, to the empty seat directly beside his throne. His seat, the Queen's seat. He released her hand only once she was settled, then addressed the hall with cold authority. "Anyone who disrespects my queen disrespects this crown," he said. "I suggest you all remember that." Then he sat beside her, close enough that she could smell pine and smoke, and resumed his conversation with his advisors as if nothing had happened. The hall slowly returned to life. Music started again. Conversations resumed. But everything had shifted. The court had been reminded publicly, unmistakably, that Mira was under the king's protection. She sat very still, her wine-stained gown clinging to her skin, and tried to parse what had just happened. Tried to understand why he'd intervened when their agreement was supposed to be transactional, performative. But his wolf had snarled when Corinne spilled that wine. She'd felt it, a ripple of barely leashed fury that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with something far more primal. "Mate," her own wolf whispered. "Protect. Ours." She told it to be quiet. Later that night, after she'd changed into clean clothes and washed the wine from her skin, Mira made her way to the council chambers. They were empty this late, which meant she could slip in unnoticed and observe what happened during the day. Listen to what was really being discussed when the doors were closed. But tonight, she needed something else. Something that would remind her why she was here, why she'd accepted this arrangement in the first place. Control, strategy, freedom. She found Theron in the king's private study instead. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight, a glass of wine in one hand. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked. Mira closed the door behind her. "What would that have accomplished?" "You would have defended yourself, proven you won't be walked over. Or I would have proven I'm exactly as temperamental and unsuited as they already believe." She crossed to the desk, running her fingers along its edge. "Let them underestimate me. It's easier that way." Theron finally turned. His eyes were dark, shadowed with something she couldn't name. "You've been attending council meetings," he said. It wasn't a question, she went still. He'd noticed, of course he'd noticed. I've been listening, she corrected carefully. No one pays attention to servants standing in corners, or queens who aren't supposed to understand what's being discussed. And what have you learned? Mira met his gaze. This was dangerous territory. If she revealed too much, he'd know she'd been planning something long before he ever chose her. But if she said too little, he'd dismiss her the way everyone else did. Lord Finch is being bribed by the Eastern merchants, she said quietly. The trade routes you're negotiating are already compromised. You'll lose the deal unless you replace him. Theron's expression shifted. Surprise, then calculation. How long have you known? 3 weeks. I documented it. You documented. He stopped. Set down his wine glass. What else have you documented? Everything, she wanted to say. Every corrupt official, every affair, every weak point in this palace's power structure. 7 years' worth of insurance. But she wasn't ready to show him that hand yet. Enough, she said instead. For a long moment he just looked at her. Really looked. Not the way he had on the dais tonight. Performative, protective, playing a role. This was something else. Something that felt like recognition. You're not what I expected, he said finally. Neither are you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with a truth neither of them was ready to examine. Theron crossed to the bookshelves, pulled down a slim volume and handed it to her. Military strategy. The same text she'd been reading in secret for months. If you're going to listen to council meetings, he said, you should know what you're listening for. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. Mira took the book, her fingers brushing his. The bond sparked again, quieter this time, but no less insistent. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, then returned to the window. The conversation was over. Mira left the study and made her way back to her chambers, the book clutched against her chest. She shouldn't feel anything, shouldn't let gratitude or hope, or the dangerous warmth of being seen crack the walls she'd spent 7 years building. This was still temporary. Still transactional. Still a year and nothing more. But when she reached the library an hour later, unable to sleep, she found Theron already there. He sat across from her usual chair, a different book in his hands, and said nothing as she settled into her seat. Just turned a page. Kept reading. The silence between them felt less hostile than it had before. The council chamber smelled of old parchment and ambition. Mira stood against the back wall. Hands folded, eyes downcast, the perfect picture of a decoration placed there to fulfill a formality. The counselors barely glanced at her when she entered. Good. Let them dismiss her. Let them think she was merely ornamental. 2 weeks had passed since that night in the library. 2 weeks of careful observation, of attending these meetings at Theron's request while saying nothing. 2 weeks of cataloging every hesitation, every power play, every moment of weakness she could use later. Today, that changed. Lord Finch was presenting the Eastern trade proposal, his voice droning on about tariff adjustments and merchant routes. The council nodded along, half listening. Theron sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He looked bored, patient, royal. But Mira had learned to read the tension in his shoulders. He was frustrated. The deal Finch was proposing would cost the kingdom a fortune in the long term, and everyone in this room was too lazy or corrupt to care. The Eastern merchants have agreed to our terms, Finch concluded. All that remains is the king's signature. Silence. Then the scrape of parchment sliding across polished wood. Wait. The word came out before Mira could second-guess herself. Every head in the room turned. Lord Finch's expression flickered from surprise to irritation. The other counselors looked confused, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Theron's gaze found hers. Steady. Curious. Not angry. She stepped forward, heart hammering against her ribs, and forced her voice to stay level. The northern route would be more profitable, she said. The Eastern merchants are demanding exclusive access to the river ports, which would cripple our trade with the southern kingdoms. But the northern route through the mountain pass would bypass that entirely. Shorter distance, lower tariffs, and it would strengthen our alliance with the Highland clans. Lord Finch's face flushed. Your Majesty, the northern pass is dangerous. Bandits, harsh weather, the Highland clans patrol those roads, Mira interrupted. They've been trying to negotiate better trade terms for 3 years. If we offer them security contracts and fair pricing, they'll protect our caravans. The Eastern merchants are overcharging because they know we have no alternative. Give us one, and their prices will drop by half within a month. The room went very quiet. Mira could feel Duke Garrett's eyes on her from across the table. Watchful. Calculating. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the weight of his attention. Theron leaned back in his chair, one finger tapping against the armrest. Interesting, he said softly. Lord Finch, why wasn't this option presented? Finch sputtered. The northern route hasn't been viable in decades. It's a risk. Everything is a risk. Theron's voice was mild, but the command underneath was absolute. I want a full analysis of both routes on my desk by tomorrow. Include the Highland clan's most recent proposals. Finch's jaw tightened. Yes, Your Majesty. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. The counselors kept glancing at Mira, reassessing. She returned to her place against the wall, pulse still racing, and tried not to feel the mate bond humming with something that felt dangerously close to pride. After that, Theron asked for her opinion more frequently. Small things. At first, a question about supply routes, a request to review staff reports. The council bristled, but they couldn't argue. Not when her suggestions kept proving accurate. Within a week, she'd identified 3 corrupt stewards who'd been skimming from the palace accounts. Theron replaced them quietly. The palace ran smoother. The waste decreased. And slowly, grudgingly, the council started listening when she spoke. Across the room, Duke Garrett smiled and said nothing. The evenings became theirs. It started accidentally, Mira reviewing ledgers in the king's study because the light was better. Theron working through correspondence at his desk. They didn't speak much at first. Just shared the space, the scratch of quills on parchment and the crackle of the fireplace filling the silence. But silence had a way of growing comfortable. And comfort had a way of loosening tongues. Why do you do this? Theron asked one night. Mira looked up from a grain inventory report. Do what? Help me. He set down his quill, the candlelight catching the sharp angles of his face. You could fulfill our agreement by simply appearing at functions. You don't need to involve yourself in kingdom management. Would you prefer I didn't? That's not what I'm asking. She studied him, trying to parse the question beneath the question. He looked tired tonight. The shadows under his eyes were darker, his shoulders carrying weight that never seemed to ease. I like puzzles, she said finally. Your kingdom is full of them. His mouth quirked, almost a smile. That's one way to describe corruption and political dysfunction. It could be worse. How? You could have no one trying to fix it. Theron's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then he picked up his quill again, but something in the air between them had softened. Where did you learn to do this? He asked. Strategy. Analysis. Most nobles can barely balance their own household accounts. I had time. Mira returned to her report, keeping her voice light. And invisibility is an excellent teacher. People say things around servants they'd never say to each other. 7 years of listening. 7 years of surviving. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. She felt Theron's attention shift, focus narrowing on her like a blade finding its mark. Your family, he said quietly. What happened to them? Mira's fingers tightened on the parchment. This was dangerous territory, too close to the truth of who she'd been, why she'd stayed, what she was still protecting. My father gambled, she said, keeping her tone flat. Lost everything. My mother died shortly after. I was sent here because it was the only option that didn't involve starvation. She looked up sharply. He meant it. There was no pity in his expression, just quiet acknowledgement. Understanding, maybe, from someone who knew what it meant to carry losses you couldn't fix. It was a long time ago, she said. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, it didn't. The mate bond pulsed in her chest, warm and insistent. Her wolf pressed closer, wanting to reach for him, wanting comfort she couldn't afford to accept. Mira stood, needing distance, needing air that didn't smell like pine and smoke and the maddening pull of something she'd agreed to ignore. "I should go," she said. Theron rose too, moving around the desk. Not toward her exactly. Just closer. Close enough that she could see the way his hands flexed at his sides, as if he wanted to reach out but wasn't sure if he should. Mira. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had 2 weeks ago. Softer. More real. She made the mistake of meeting his eyes. The bond surged. Her wolf whined. And Theron's hand lifted just slightly, just enough before he caught himself and turned it into adjusting his sleeve, but not before his fingers had brushed hers. The contact was brief, accidental, electric. The mate bond roared to life between them, a rush of heat and recognition, and want so fierce it stole her breath. She could smell his desire, feel his heartbeat, sense his wolf straining toward hers with the same desperate need she was fighting to suppress. Theron pulled back first. Fast, his jaw tight, his breathing unsteady. "Forgive me," he said roughly. "It's fine." It wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Mira fled before she could do something catastrophic like close the distance between them. Like ask him to touch her again. Like admit that the bond wasn't inconvenient. It was becoming impossible. She made it to her chambers, closed the door, and leaned against it with shaking hands. 1 year. That was the agreement. 1 year and she'd be free. But freedom was starting to feel like a punishment instead of a prize. The news came 3 days later, delivered by a breathless messenger during morning council. The merchant caravan Mira had personally negotiated with the northern route deal that was supposed to prove her competence had failed to arrive. No word, no explanation, just gone. Lord Finch didn't bother hiding his satisfaction. "Perhaps," he said smoothly. Her Majesty's enthusiasm exceeded her experience. The council murmured agreement. Mira sat very still, her mind racing through possibilities. The Highland clans wouldn't have betrayed the agreement. The route was secure, which meant someone had interfered. She looked across the table and found Duke Garrett watching her. He smiled. The ballroom glittered like something out of a dream Mira had never dared to have. Candlelight refracted through crystal chandeliers, casting gold across silk and jewels and faces painted with anticipation. The Harvest Festival was the kingdom's grandest celebration, a night when every noble house gathered to display their wealth, their power, their perfect lives. Mira stood at the edge of the crowd and tried not to feel like she was drowning. The gown they'd given her was beautiful, deep burgundy velvet that hugged her curves and flowed to the floor in heavy folds. The bodice was embroidered with gold thread, intricate patterns that must have taken weeks to complete. It fit her perfectly. It made her visible in a way that felt like standing naked before a firing squad. Every eye that landed on her carried the same judgment. Every whispered conversation behind fans and goblets was about her. The queen who the 500th failed. The bet bride who'd proven herself exactly as incompetent as they'd always known she'd be. The caravan's disappearance had done its damage. 3 days of council meetings where Lord Finch had smiled sympathetically while dismantling every argument she'd made. 3 days of Theron's careful neutrality, his refusal to defend her publicly even as the mate bond ached between them like an open wound. She hadn't spoken to him since the morning the news arrived. Hadn't let herself be alone with him. It was easier that way. Safer. Her wolf paced restlessly, confused by the distance. It didn't understand strategy, didn't understand why they couldn't just go to him, claim him, trust him. Mira understood perfectly. Trust was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. The music swelled a shift in tempo that made the crowd part, forming a clear path from the dais to the center of the ballroom. Tradition. The king and queen's dance. A public display of unity meant to bless the harvest and strengthen the kingdom's bonds. Mira's stomach twisted. Theron rose from his seat, descending the steps with that fluid grace that made her wolf whine. He wore formal black silver embroidery catching the light, and he looked every inch the king. Untouchable. Perfect. Nothing like the man who'd sat across from her in libraries and asked about her past with quiet curiosity. He stopped in front of her, extended his hand. The ballroom held its breath. Mira looked at his hand. Those long fingers she remembered brushing hers. The warmth she could still feel if she let herself and wanted to run. Wanted to disappear. Wanted to be anyone but the woman standing here in borrowed finery, pretending she belonged. But running would prove them right, and Mira had never given anyone that satisfaction. She placed her hand in his. The bond sparked to life instantly, that familiar rush of heat and recognition that made her chest ache. Theron's fingers closed around hers, firm and steady, and he led her onto the dance floor without a word. The music began. A waltz, slow and sweeping. Theron pulled her into position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers at shoulder height. Proper. Formal. Exactly the distance protocol demanded, except he was looking at her like no one else in the room existed. They began to move. Mira had learned to dance as a child, before everything fell apart, and her body remembered the steps even if her mind was screaming at her to focus, to maintain control, to not let the warmth of his hand at her waist undo every wall she'd built. "You're trembling," Theron murmured. "I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar." She met his eyes, gray and storm-dark, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her wolf press against her ribs, straining toward him. "They're all watching," she said quietly. "Let them. They think I'm a failure." "I don't." The words hit her harder than they should have. She stumbled slightly, and his hand tightened at her waist, steadying her, keeping her close. The scent of pine and smoke wrapped around her, familiar and maddening. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, could feel the controlled power in every movement as he guided her through the steps. He spun her, and when she came back to him, he pulled her closer. Not enough to be improper, just enough that the space between them felt charged, electric. "I'm sorry," he said, so quietly only she could hear, "for not defending you in counsel, for maintaining distance when you needed. Stop. Mira, you did what you had to do. I understand politics. This isn't about politics." His voice roughened, dropped lower. "I should have believed you, trusted your instincts. Instead, I let them question you while I sat there like a coward." Her breath caught. The mate bond flared between them, responding to the raw honesty in his words. "You're the king," she whispered. "You have to be careful." "I'm tired of being careful." He looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "I am so tired of pretending you are not the most fascinating person in this room." The ballroom blurred. The music faded. There was only Theron, looking at her like she was worth something, like she was real. "Theron," she breathed. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to pull away, to stop this before it became something they couldn't take back. Mira didn't move. His lips met hers, and the world caught fire. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question asked with touch instead of words. But when Mira's hand tightened on his shoulder when her wolf howled, "Yes, yes," finally Theron made a low sound in his chest and deepened the kiss. The mate bond exploded between them. Heat and light and a rightness so absolute it felt like every missing piece of her suddenly clicking into place. She could taste him, warmth and need, and something that felt dangerously close to reverence. Could feel his wolf calling to hers, demanding, claiming, home. Her free hand came up to his jaw, fingers trembling against stubble and warm skin. His arm wrapped more fully around her waist, pulling her against him until there was no space left between their bodies. The ballroom existed somewhere far away. Mira existed only here, in this moment, in the circle of his arms where nothing could touch her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the silence was deafening. Mira blinked, focused, saw the entire court staring at them with expressions ranging from shock to scandal to something that might have been awe. Theron's hand still rested at her waist. His thumb moved in small circles against the velvet, as if he couldn't quite make himself let go. "Come with me," he said roughly. He didn't wait for an answer, just took her hand and led her through the crowd, past staring nobles and whispering courtiers, out onto a private balcony that overlooked the palace gardens. The night air was cool against her flushed skin. Mira leaned against the stone railing, trying to catch her breath, trying to think past the bond still singing in her veins. "I didn't mean to," Theron started. "I know, but I'm not sorry." She looked at him. He stood close enough to touch, his hair slightly mussed from her fingers, his eyes dark with something that made her wolf beg her to close the distance again. "This changes things," she said. "Does it have to? You just kissed me in front of your entire court. I've wanted to kiss you for weeks." The confession came out raw, honest. "Every time you speak in council meetings, every time you look at me like I'm not performing correctly, every time you challenge me or surprise me or make me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how." Mira's throat tightened. This was supposed to be temporary. "I know. 1 year, that was the deal." "I know," he said again, softer. "But somewhere between the deal and now, I stopped caring about the bet, stopped thinking about what happens when the year ends, started thinking about—" He stopped, drew a breath. "You." Her wolf howled, demanded she reach for him, demanded she say the words building in her chest. But words were dangerous. Hope was dangerous. And Mira had survived 7 years by never letting herself want things she couldn't control. "I didn't expect kindness from you," she whispered. Theron moved closer, not touching, just near enough that she could feel his warmth. "I didn't expect to care," he admitted. "Didn't expect to look forward to evenings in the study more than any state function. Didn't expect my wolf to wake me up at night because it can sense you're 3 rooms away and it wants." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't expect you." The space between them felt impossible to maintain. Mira's hand lifted without conscious thought, reaching for him. His fingers caught hers, threaded through them. The bond pulsed, warm and insistent. They stood there, hands joined, breath mingling in the cool night air. Theron leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "Tell me you feel this too," he whispered. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." "You're not." "Then, this is temporary," Mira said, even as her heart screamed liar. 1 year, then we both get what we want. And what if what I want has changed?" She pulled back, met his eyes, saw the truth there, naked and terrifying, and everything she couldn't afford to believe in. "It can't," she said. "We agreed. Agreements can be renegotiated. Theron." He kissed her again. Softer this time, sweeter. A question and a plea and a promise she didn't know how to accept. When he pulled away, Myra's resolve was crumbling. 1 year, she repeated, desperate, clinging to the plan that had kept her safe. "That's all this is." Theron's expression shuddered. Not angry, just sad. "If that's what you need to tell yourself," he said quietly. He stepped back. The loss of his warmth felt like being plunged into ice water. "I should return to the festival," he said. "People will talk if we're gone too long. Let them talk." A ghost of a smile. "You don't mean that." He was right. She didn't. Theron bowed formal, perfect, the king again, and left her standing alone on the balcony. Mira wrapped her arms around herself and tried not to feel like she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. "He's very good at that, isn't he?" She spun. Duke Garrett stood in the doorway, golden-haired and smiling, a glass of wine in one hand. "At what?" Mira asked carefully. "Making you believe he means it." Garrett stepped onto the balcony, all charm and false sympathy. "The concern, the care, the pretty words about how special you are." Her wolf bristled. Mira kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Your Majesty, has he explained why he really chose you, what the bet truly meant to him? He was drunk. You challenged him. He accepted. Is that what he told you?" Garrett laughed. Soft and cruel. How wonderfully simple. "I suppose it's easier than admitting the truth." Mira's fingers tightened on the railing. What truth? Garrett leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That you were never supposed to survive this. 3 days after the festival, they came for her. Mira was in the council chambers when Duke Garrett entered with a leather portfolio under his arm and grief written across his face like a mask. She knew instantly, the way he avoided her eyes, the way the other counselors shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but eager. The way Theron's expression went carefully, dangerously blank. She'd been waiting for this move. She just hadn't expected it to hurt so much. Your Majesty, Garrett said, his voice heavy with regret. I bring grave news. Evidence has come to light that I can scarcely believe it myself. He placed the portfolio on the table, slid it toward Theron. Inside were letters, beautiful forgeries, each one written in handwriting that could have been Mira's if she'd been careless. They referenced conversations she'd had with Theron in private, detailed kingdom secrets only someone in her position would know, and they were addressed to foreign emissaries in rival kingdoms. Treason. Plain and simple. The council erupted in voices. Shock, vindication. I told you she was dangerous, but Mira barely heard them. She was watching Theron. Watching him read each letter with mounting tension in his jaw, his hands gripping the parchment hard enough to crease it. His wolf would know the letters were lies. The bond would tell him. Unless he'd decided the bond was just as inconvenient as she'd claimed it was. Lord Finch stood. These documents prove what many of us feared. The Queen has been compromising our security from the beginning. She's been manipulating the king, another counselor added. Using dark magic, perhaps. Enchantment. Garrett held up a hand, silencing them with practiced ease. I take no pleasure in this. The Queen has surprised us all with her intelligence. But intelligence in service of betrayal is still betrayal. Mira remained perfectly still. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves. She could smell Garrett's satisfaction beneath the performance of sorrow wine and something bitter, like ambition left too long in the sun. Theron finally looked up. His eyes met hers across the table. These allegations are serious, he said quietly. They are, Mira agreed. Her voice was steady, calm. Are you asking me if they're true? The evidence can be fabricated, you know that. Something flickered across his face. Pain. Doubt. The bond pulled between them, tight and aching. Protocol demands an investigation, he said, and she could hear the apology underneath the formality. Until this is resolved, you'll be confined to your quarters, under guard. There it was. The moment where he chose duty over her. She'd known it would come eventually. She just hadn't expected it to feel like being gutted. Mira stood. The guards moved forward automatically. As you wish, Your Majesty. She left the council chamber with her head high and her heart breaking. The Queen's chambers felt smaller with 2 guards stationed outside her door. Mira paced the length of the room, her mind cataloging options and outcomes while her wolf whined low and continuous in her chest. He believed them. Or he didn't, but he believed the law more than he believed her. Either way, the result was the same. The door opened hours later. No knock, just Theron, entering her rooms like he still had the right. Mira turned from the window. He looked terrible shadows under his eyes, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. The bond between them pulled painfully, wanting to close the distance, wanting comfort neither of them knew how to give. I need to ask you something, he said. I know. Did you write those letters? Mira looked at him. Really looked. At the king who the 500th kissed her in front of his entire court 3 days ago. The man who'd admitted he didn't expect to care. The mate who was standing 10 feet away from her like she might be a threat. Do you believe I would betray you? She asked. The question hung in the air between them. Theron opened his mouth. Closed it. His hands flexed at his sides. He hesitated. Just 1 second. One tiny, devastating pause where doubt flickered across his face before he could hide it. And something in Mira broke. Get out, she said quietly. Mira, you want the truth? The truth is that I've spent every day in this palace watching you navigate impossible political waters. I've seen you balance duty and desire and the weight of a crown that was thrust on you too young. I've watched you be patient with a council that undermines you and kind to a wife you never wanted. Her voice didn't rise. It stayed perfectly level. That made it worse. And the moment someone you trust more than me presents you with lies you doubt, even for a second, even though your wolf knows the truth, even though the bond is screaming at you that those letters are false. Garrett has been my friend since we were children, Theron said, his voice rough. He has never given me reason to. And I have? Silence. The mate bond ached between them like a physical wound. Mira could feel Theron's wolf howling, could sense the way it strained toward her, could smell the conflict warring in his scent, pine and smoke and something sharp that might have been guilt. But he didn't move, didn't cross the room, didn't choose her. I need you to leave, Mira said. Please. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Might finally close the distance and damn the protocol and the doubt and everything else that stood between them. But he was a king before he was a man, and duty always won. Theron turned and left without another word. Mira waited until the door closed, until his footsteps faded down the corridor, until she was certain she was alone. Then she crossed to the wardrobe, reached into the hidden pocket she'd sewn into the lining years ago, and pulled out a worn leather ledger. 7 years of documentation, every whispered conversation she'd overheard while carrying linens, every bribe she'd witnessed while serving wine, every backroom deal conducted in her presence as if she were furniture. She'd spent 7 years preparing for the moment her invisibility would buy her freedom. She'd never imagined she'd use it to save the man who couldn't trust her. Mira opened the ledger to the section marked with a small G and began to read. Every meeting Duke Garrett had attended with foreign emissaries over the past 3 years. Every bribe he'd accepted. Every piece of the conspiracy she'd been tracking since the day she understood he wanted more than friendship from his king. She's the 500th been protecting Theron from threats he never saw coming. And tomorrow, she'd prove it. The throne room had been transformed into a trial chamber. Extra seating lined the walls, packed with nobles who'd come to witness her downfall. The air smelled of anticipation and expensive perfume, thick enough to choke on. Mira stood in the center of the room, hands folded, while whispers buzzed around her like wasps. Theron sat on the throne, gray eyes fixed on some point above her head. He looked carved from stone. Untouchable. Every inch the king who the 500th chosen duty over her. The mate bond ached between them, a constant throb of pain that neither acknowledged. Duke Garrett stood before the council table, grief painted across his handsome face like a mask. He held up the forged letters with trembling hands. "It brings me no joy to present this evidence," he began, his voice heavy with false sorrow. "The Queen and the First have disagreed on matters of policy, but I never imagined she would betray the kingdom itself." He passed the letters to the council members. They read in silence, their expressions hardening. Lord Finch stood. "These documents detail strategic information about our northern defenses, information only someone in Her Majesty's position would possess." "She's been selling secrets to our enemies," another counselor added. "Using her influence over the king to gain access to classified intelligence." Influence. The word dripped with implication. Enchantment. Dark magic. The same whispers Garrett had been seeding for weeks. Lady Corrine spoke from the gallery, her voice carrying across the room. "I always knew there was something unnatural about her rise to power. No one changes that completely without help." The court murmured agreement. Mira stood perfectly still and let them reveal themselves. Every accusation, every moment of cruelty disguised as concern, she catalogued it all. Garrett turned to her, his brown eyes warm with false sympathy. "Your Majesty, I beg you to explain. Tell us these documents are forgeries. Tell us there's been some terrible mistake." The room fell silent, waiting. Mira looked at Theron. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. His hands gripped the armrests of his throne hard enough that his knuckles showed white. "I have nothing to explain," she said calmly. But I do have evidence of my own to present. She reached into the deep pocket of her gown and pulled out the leather ledger. 7 years of documentation. 7 years of invisible observation. 7 years of building the only insurance policy a powerless woman could claim. Garrett's confident smile faltered slightly. Mira opened the ledger to a marked page and began to read. On the 16th of March, 3 years ago, Duke Garrett met with an emissary from the Eastern Kingdoms in a tavern outside the city walls. The emissary paid him 2,000 gold marks in exchange for information about our grain stores and harvest projections. The room went very quiet. On the 8th of June, 2 years ago, he accepted another bribe, this time 5,000 marks to delay a military supply shipment that would have reinforced our southern border. Lord Finch stood. Your Majesty, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof? Mira turned a page. The Eastern emissary's name was Kellen Moore. He stayed at the Silver Heart Inn under a false name. The tavern keeper can verify the meeting. The bribe was paid in marked coins from the Eastern Mint distinctive because they bear the old king's face, which hasn't been used in currency for 4 years. She looked directly at Garrett. His mask was slipping. The warm brown eyes had gone cold. Should I continue? She asked quietly. This is absurd, Garrett said, but his voice had lost its practiced smoothness. She's fabricating evidence to deflect from her own crimes. Then explain the merchant caravan, Mira said. The one that failed to arrive 3 days after the harvest festival. The trade deal I negotiated that you sabotaged by bribing the Highland merchants to withdraw. She named the merchants, listed the amounts, provided dates and locations for every meeting. The council members looked at each other, uncertainty spreading like cracks in ice. Mira turned another page. On the 4th of September this year, you met with Chancellor Voss from the rival kingdom. He offered you the ducal throne if you could destabilize King Theron's rule enough to justify a challenge. You've been working toward a coup for 3 years. The throne room erupted, voices overlapping, nobles shouting questions, council members demanding answers. Garrett's composure shattered completely. She's lying. These documents are meticulously verified, Mira interrupted. Every conversation you've had with foreign emissaries over the past 3 years is documented in this ledger, including your plot to use me as a weapon against the king. The bet was never about humiliating Theron. It was about giving him a queen so unsuitable that the council would lose faith in his judgment. She met Garrett's eyes. Watched the charming mask dissolve into something ugly. You underestimated me, she said simply. You all did, and I let you, because invisible people hear everything. Garrett lunged forward. You manipulative little... enough. Theron's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He rose from the throne, and the room fell instantly silent. His wolf was close to the surface now. Mira could sense it pressing against his control, could smell the surge of protective fury in his scent. He descended the dais steps slowly, walked past the council table, past Garrett, until he stood directly in front of Mira. Their eyes met for the first time since the accusation. The mate bond surged between them, not painful now, but alive, thrumming with recognition and something that felt dangerously close to pride. How long have you known? Theron asked quietly. The question could have meant many things. How long had she known about Garrett's conspiracy? How long had she been documenting corruption? How long had she been protecting him? Mira understood what he was really asking. How long have you been playing a game I never saw? Since the day I arrived at court, she said. I've been watching, listening, learning, waiting for the moment when knowledge might buy me freedom. And you said nothing. Would you have believed a servant? She kept her voice steady. Would anyone? Theron's jaw worked. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Truly seeing her. Not the bet bride or the political arrangement or the mate bond he'd tried to ignore, but the woman who'd been standing in plain sight all along. You've been protecting me, he said. Not a question. A realization. From threats you never saw coming. Mira confirmed. The silence stretched between them, weighted with everything they hadn't said, everything they'd been too afraid to name. Then Theron turned to the council. Arrest Duke Garrett. Confine him to the dungeons pending a full investigation into these charges. The guards moved immediately. Garrett fought, shouting protests and accusations, but they dragged him from the throne room anyway. His voice echoed down the corridor, growing fainter, until the heavy doors closed and cut it off completely. Theron addressed the council with cold precision. Every claim Her Majesty has made will be investigated. Every bribe verified. Every meeting confirmed. And anyone found to have aided Duke Garrett in his conspiracy will face the same consequences. The council members went pale. Several shifted in their seats, suddenly interested in the floor. "This trial is concluded," Theron said. "You're all dismissed." The council gathered their papers with shaking hands and filed out in silence. Within minutes, the throne room was empty except for Mira and Theron. The mate bond pulled taut between them. Demanding, insistent. Theron stood 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, close enough that her wolf whined and strained toward him. "Stay," he said quietly. Just one word. But it carried the weight of everything, apology and wonder, and a question he didn't know how to ask. Mira stayed. The throne room felt larger with just the two of them in it. The silence pressed down like weight, broken only by the distant sound of guards' footsteps fading down stone corridors. Mira stood where the trial had left her, ledger still clutched in her hands, while Theron remained 3 feet away. Too far. Too close. The mate bond pulled between them like a rope drawn taut. Theron moved first. He descended from the dais slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood directly in front of her. Close enough that she could see the storm of emotion in his gray eyes, regret and wonder, and something that looked dangerously close to reverence. "Forgive me," he said quietly. Mira's throat tightened. "For what? For doubting you? For not seeing you?" His voice roughened. "For making you a bet instead of a choice." She looked down at the ledger in her hands. 7 years of careful observation. 7 years of building armor out of information. 7 years of preparing for freedom. "I knew," she said. Theron went still. "Knew what?" "About the wager. Garrett told me the night of the banquet." Mira met his eyes. He wanted me to understand exactly what I was. A joke, a punchline, something to be endured and then discarded. Pain flashed across Theron's face. "Mira, I accepted your deal anyway," she continued. "Not because I was grateful for the elevation, not because I thought you'd fall in love with me. I accepted because I wanted freedom on my own terms, and you were offering me a way to earn it." She set the ledger down on the nearest table. "I chose to win the bet myself." Theron stared at her like she'd just rewritten every assumption he'd ever made. "You've been playing a game I didn't even know existed. I've been surviving. There's a difference." He stepped closer. The scent of pine and smoke wrapped around her, familiar and maddening. Her wolf pressed against her ribs, whining. "When did you stop caring about the bet?" she asked. "Weeks ago." The confession came out raw, honest. "Maybe the night I found you in the library. Maybe earlier. I stopped counting days until the year ended and started dreading the moment you'd leave." Mira's chest ached. The bond thrummed between them, alive and demanding. "Every evening we spent together," Theron continued. "Every conversation about trade routes and kingdom management and your terrible sense of humor. It stopped being strategy. It stopped being the arrangement. It just became." He stopped, drew a breath. "You." Her wolf howled. "Mate. Finally, home. Do you feel it?" Theron asked quietly. "The bond, or is that something else you've learned to ignore?" Mira looked at him, this king, who the 500th kissed her in front of his entire court, who'd hesitated when she needed him to believe, who was standing here now asking for something he had no right to expect. "I've felt it since the day we shook hands," she whispered. The air between them changed, charged. Electric. Theron's hand lifted, hovering near her face, not touching. "Asking permission." "May I?" he said. One word. but it carried the weight of everything: apology and hope and a future neither of them had planned for. Mira nodded. His fingers brushed her jaw, feather light, and the bond ignited like wildfire. She leaned into his touch without thinking, her eyes closing as warmth flooded through her chest. 7 years of armor, 7 years of walls, all of it crumbling under the simple fact of his hand against her skin. "I want to claim you," Saren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because of the bet, not because protocol demands it, because when I look at you, I see the only future I want." Mira opened her eyes. "What are you asking?" "Permission." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "To complete the bond, to make this real, to choose you the way I should have from the beginning." Her wolf went silent, not from fear, from certainty. "Yes," Mira breathed. Taryn pulled her close, one hand cupping her face, the other sliding to her waist, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak, not the desperate kiss from the festival. This was different. Slower. A promise made with touch instead of words. The mate bond sang between them, warm and right and utterly undeniable. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. They stood there, breathing in sync, while the bond built and built until it felt like her entire body was vibrating with need. "Tell me if you want me to stop," Theron murmured against her skin. Mira's answer was to tilt her head, exposing the curve of her neck. An invitation, a surrender, a choice. Theron's breath hitched. His lips found the spot where her neck met her shoulder, that sensitive place her wolf had been guiding him toward since the moment the bond snapped into place. He kissed it once. Gentle, reverent, then he bit. The claiming wasn't pain, it was completion. A rush of warmth and copper and magic that flooded every nerve until Mira gasped and clung to him, fingers digging into his shoulders. She could feel him not just physically, but deeper. The bond opening fully, letting her sense his wolf's fierce protectiveness, his human heart's desperate relief, the love he'd been too afraid to name. "Mate," his wolf growled. "Ours." Finally, when Theron pulled back, there was blood on his lips and wonder in his eyes. "Your turn," he said hoarsely. He tilted his head, offering his neck the same way she had, trusting her, choosing her. Mira rose on her toes, pressed her lips to his throat, and bit. The bond completed with a surge that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She tasted copper and pine, and the wild, untamed essence of the man who'd become her mate, despite every wall she'd built. His wolf howled in triumph. Hers answered. And for the first time in 7 years, Mira felt safe. They held each other in the empty throne room, foreheads pressed together, breathing hard. The bond settled between them, no longer a pull or an ache, but a presence. Warm, constant, unbreakable. "I love you," Theron whispered. "I don't know when it happened. Somewhere between the library and the council meetings, and the moment you dismantled Garrett's conspiracy with a ledger and 7 years' worth of patience. But I love you." Mira's eyes burned. She'd spent so long believing love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that would be used against her. But this didn't feel weak. It felt like power. "I love you too," she said, "even when I didn't want to, even when it terrified me." Theron kissed her again, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, he took her hand and led her from the throne room, through corridors lit by moonlight, to his private chambers. The fire had been lit. The room smelled of cedar and warmth, and when Theron closed the door behind them, shutting out the palace and the court and everything that had tried to keep them apart, Mira finally let herself believe. This was real. This was hers. This was home. They stood in the firelight, hands joined, the claiming bites on their necks still tender. The bond hummed between them, content and complete. "What happens now?" Mira asked. Theron pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Now we figure out how to be mates instead of a transaction, how to be partners instead of a king and a bet. And the kingdom? We'll adjust." His lips found her temple. "They underestimated you once. They won't make that mistake again." Mira leaned into him, letting his warmth surround her. For the first time in 7 years, she wasn't planning her next move, wasn't calculating exits or building contingencies. She was just here, present, claimed home. "I have a question," Theron murmured against her hair. "What? What do you want now? The deal we made, the estate, the independence, the freedom. It's yours. You've earned it 1,000 times over." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "So what do you want, Mira?" She looked at him, this king who'd the 500th seen her. This mate who'd chosen her. This man who'd given her everything she'd asked for and was still offering more. And Mira, who had spent 7 years planning her escape, made a different choice. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because of a deal. Not because the bond demands it. Because I choose you." 1 week after the claiming, the throne room filled again. This time, there were no accusations, no forged letters, no conspiracy unraveling in real time. Just the formal ceremony Theron had called to address the kingdom, and the visiting dignitaries who traveled from neighboring territories, expecting to witness a scandal. Mira stood beside the throne, her hand resting in Theron's. The claiming bite on her neck was still visible above the collar of her gown, a deep green velvet that made her feel less like she was playing dress-up and more like she belonged. The mate bond hummed between them, warm and constant, no longer something to hide or deny. The court watched with barely concealed wariness. They'd seen Garrett dragged away in chains. They'd heard the truth about his conspiracy. And they were learning, slowly and painfully, that the queen they the 500th dismissed was far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Theron rose from his throne. The room fell instantly silent. "Eyes, do you hear?" he began, his voice carrying the weight of command, to make several announcements regarding the future of this kingdom. Mira could feel the tension rippling through the crowd. Nobles shifted in their seats. Council members sat rigid, waiting. "First," Theron continued, "I renounce the wager that brought Queen Mira to this throne. It was made in arrogance and accepted in folly. Whatever the bet claimed to prove about power or control, it proved nothing except my own blindness." He turned to Mira, his gray eyes soft. "She is not my queen because the first chose her to win a wager. She is my queen because she is my fated mate. Because she is brilliant, fierce, and more capable than anyone in this room gave her credit for. And because I choose her every day, with full knowledge of exactly who she is." The mate bond flared between them. Mira's wolf purred, content. Theron faced the court again. "Second, Duke Garrett has been found guilty of treason and conspiracy against the crown. He has been stripped of his title and exiled from this kingdom. Any who aided him in his schemes have been given one opportunity to confess and face reduced sentences. Those who continue to hide their involvement will face the full weight of the law when they are discovered." Several nobles went pale. Mira made note of which ones. "And third," Theron said, "Queen Mira will address you directly regarding reforms she will be implementing. You will listen, you will comply, and you will remember that underestimating her once was foolish. Doing so again would be suicidal." He sat, gesturing for Mira to step forward. This was it, her first public address as queen, not the bet bride, not the scandal. The woman who would help shape this kingdom's future. Mira moved to the center of the dais, looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see if she would crumble under their scrutiny. She didn't. "I will not apologize," she began, her voice steady and clear, "for my body, my background, or my presence in this throne room. I did not ask to be chosen as part of a wager, but I am here now, and I intend to make that count for something." The room was utterly silent. Effective immediately, all palace appointments will be merit-based. Your family name will not save you from incompetence. Your wealth will not excuse corruption. If you cannot perform your duties with integrity, you will be replaced by someone who can. She could feel the shock radiating through the crowd. This wasn't what they'd expected. They'd expected meekness, gratitude, deference. "Second," Mira continued, "protections will be extended to all Omegas, and lower-ranking wolves in the kingdom's employ. Fair wages, safe working conditions, the right to report abuse without fear of retaliation. These are not requests, they are law. A few council members exchanged glances. Lord Finch looked like he might faint. And third, this kingdom will no longer measure worth by appearance. Competence, courage, and character will be the standards by which we judge each other. Anyone who cannot meet that standard is welcome to leave. She let the words settle, let them understand that she wasn't asking for their approval. I spent 7 years invisible in this palace, Mira said quietly. 7 years watching, listening, learning. I know who you are, I know what you've done, and I know that change will not come easily to people who have benefited from the old systems. Her gaze swept the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. But it will come, because I am not going anywhere, and neither is this kingdom's future. She stepped back. Theron rose and took her hand, threading their fingers together in full view of the court. The applause started slowly hesitant, uncertain. Then one of the visiting dignitaries stood, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Others followed. Within moments, the entire room was on its feet. Not all of them meant it. Mira could see the forced smiles, the resentful glares hidden behind polite masks. But that didn't matter. They were standing. They were acknowledging her. And they would learn. After the ceremony, a foreign emissary approached Theron, an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair. "Your Majesty," she said, "I came expecting a scandal. Instead, I find myself impressed." She glanced at Mira. "Your kingdom's strength just doubled." Theron smiled. "I'm aware. Treat her well," the emissary added. "Queens like that don't come along often." "I know," Theron said softly. "Believe me, I know." That evening, as the sun set over the palace, Mira and Theron walked through the gardens. The air smelled of roses and evening dew, cool and sweet after the heat of the day. Fireflies drifted between hedges, their light soft and golden. Theron's hand was warm in hers, the mate bond contentedly, settled and sure. "I never imagined this," Mira admitted. "When Garrett told me about the bet, when you offered me that deal, I never imagined it would end like this. With you as queen, with me happy." Theron stopped walking, pulled her close, one hand cupping her face. "I never imagined you," he said quietly. "I was so focused on winning that stupid bet, on proving something to people who didn't matter, that I almost missed the only thing that did. And what's that? You." He kissed her forehead. "Fierce, brilliant, impossible you." Mira leaned into him, letting his warmth surround her. The bond settled deeper, the restless ache of wanting replaced by the steady certainty of having. "You know," she said, pulling back just enough to see his face. "Technically, I won the bet for you. Made you a respected queen out of the court's reject. You're welcome." Theron laughed, a real, unguarded sound that made her wolf purr with satisfaction. "You won far more than that," he said. "Did I? You won a kingdom, a throne, and a king who's completely, hopelessly in love with you." Mira's chest tightened, even now. Even with the bond complete and the claiming bites healed and a week of nights spent in his arms, the words still had power. "That's not nothing," she agreed softly. "No," Theron murmured against her hair. "It's everything." They stood in the garden as night fell around them, two people who'd started as strangers bound by a cruel bet and become something neither had planned for. Partners, mates, home, and somewhere in the palace behind them, the kingdom they would rebuild together, not through power or performance, but through the quiet, stubborn refusal to be anything less than exactly who they were waited for, the future they would build. Together. 1 year later, spring returned to Thornwood Palace with warmth and new growth. Mira walked through corridors that no longer felt hostile. The staff she passed more diverse now, drawn from every corner of the kingdom regardless of rank or appearance, greeted her with genuine respect. Some even smiled. A year ago, that would have been unthinkable. The council chambers had new faces, Merit-based appointments meant competent advisors replaced the corrupt or lazy. Lord Finch was gone, replaced by a sharp-minded woman from the merchant class who understood trade better than any noble ever had. The kingdom ran smoother, cleaner, better. Mira's hand rested on the swell of her stomach as she paused near the servants' entrance. A young Omega girl stood there, barely 16, holding a stack of linens with the same careful invisibility Mira remembered wearing like armor. "Excuse me?" Mira said gently. The girl startled, nearly dropping the linens. "Your Majesty, What's your name?" "Sarah, Your Majesty." Mira smiled. "Have you ever considered studying, Sarah? Trade law, perhaps? Or diplomacy?" The girl's eyes went wide. "I couldn't possibly." "There are scholarships available now, for anyone with aptitude and interest, regardless of their current position." Mira pulled a card from her pocket, one of many she carried for moments like this. "Think about it. When you're ready, bring this to the palace administrator." Sarah took the card with trembling hands. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Mira continued walking, her wolf content and her heart full. Across the hall, Theron watched his mate with undisguised affection. His wolf purred, utterly at peace. A year ago, he'd been drowning in duty and performance. Now, he had a partner who challenged him daily, and a kingdom actually worth ruling. That evening, they sat together in their private chambers, the same room where they'd stood by firelight 1 year ago, claiming bites fresh and bond newly sealed. The fire crackled now with familiar warmth. Outside, sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. "You know," Mira said, leaning back against Theron's chest, "you were supposed to prove your power with that bet. Show everyone you could make anyone into a queen through sheer force of will." Theron's arms wrapped around her, his hands settling over hers on her swollen stomach. "I'm aware. You failed spectacularly." "Did I? You didn't make me into anything. I made myself." She tilted her head to look at him. "You just finally noticed." Theron laughed softly. "Then, I lost." "No." Mira's hand tightened over his. "We both won." Their child kicked strong and insistent, already making demands. They both felt it through the bond, that small life growing between them, the future they'd built without planning, the home they'd found without looking. "I love you," Theron murmured against her hair. "I know." Mira's voice was warm with contentment. "Your wolf won't shut up about it. Neither will yours." She couldn't argue with that. They sat together as the sun set over gardens Mira had once scrubbed floors to glimpse through windows, over a palace that had dismissed her, over a kingdom they were rebuilding not through power or performance or proving anything to anyone, just through the stubborn, unglamorous work of showing up for each other every single day. Mira rested her head on Theron's shoulder. His hand stayed over hers on her stomach, protective and sure. The mate bond hummed between them, settled, complete, and utterly unbreakable. And in that moment, surrounded by warmth and love and the quiet certainty of belonging, they were finally, irrevocably home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed Mira and Theron's journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow for more stories of love, destiny, and queens who refuse to shrink. There's another tale waiting for you right now. Sometimes the greatest power isn't in being chosen. It's in choosing yourself and finding someone brave enough to stand beside you while you do.